So can you tell the readers of life how it feels? And to be a girl among all those men.
I don't mind it.
Isn't it intimidating? I mean, when I was a girl, I wasn't allowed to be competitive. I played with dolls.
Magic.
It isn't always competitive.
No, but you play to win.
Yes, but
Magic.
it can also be
What?
beautiful.
You have found your way to Lucky Paper Radio. I'm Andy, and I'm here as always with my co-host, Anthony Goblin Gardener Maddox. Hello, Anthony.
I grow the best goblins.
Now, if you knew what the card Goblin Gardener did, you would know it wasn't a compliment. That card destroys land. It's a joke because goblins aren't good gardeners.
I feel like all I did today was destroy the land.
That's true,
Hopefully
actually.
in a way that turns out better next time. But whenever you're trying to make progress, sometimes you have to make a mess.
There's a little bit of destruction in all creation. That's a very true statement. Anthony helped me out in my garden today. I'm very grateful for your green thumb, Anthony, out there digging up big roots and rocks and stuff. It's a lot of work. It's hard work. I understand why people get paid to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to feel this tomorrow.
I think you'll be fine. Plus, we cut down 2 trees. Sounds very impressive when you say it like that.
How big were the trees? You don't have to know. There were whole trees.
I mean, they were probably like 20 feet tall.
Huge.
They were about 20 feet tall, right? Wouldn't you say?
Who can say?
I think they were about 20 feet tall. They weren't so wide. Not the girthiest trees, but, a tree's a tree. And we went out there and just asserted our dominance as human beings. We modified our environment, just as humans are meant to do.
Just like we do when we design a cube.
Wow, what a segue. This is a podcast where we talk about magic, mostly cube design, game design theory, and tonight we are going to be kind of it's a little bit of a sequel to last week's episode. So last week we talked about Commander Legends with our friend and guest Daniel. We talked about his gold cube, and I recommend listening to that episode if you have not. But this week, Anthony, you and I are going to be discussing how you or I might approach designing an EDH cube. I expect that because of Commander Legends, which by all accounts, from what I've heard, is a very fun product, people are really enjoying it, having a lot of fun with it, I expect we might, as a cube community, attract some new players that are interested in making a cube that before were not because of the success of Commander Legends. So I thought you and I should talk very nuts and bolts design theory about how we would approach designing a Commander-like format for cube. So that's what we're going to be talking about. But first, we are going to do our Pack One Pick One from a listener-submitted cube, as we do every week on Lucky Paper Radio. And this week, the cube comes to us from listener and friend of the show, Alex. Thank you, Alex, for submitting your cube for the peasantry. And this is, I believe, a fully peasant cube. There might be a rare or two sneaking around in here, but I think it's a fully peasant cube. I'm actually looking at it right here. There's a couple rares. It's peasant in spirit. It's a cube that Alex built over the quarantine. Alex is relatively new to the cube world and is a friend of mine, and we've been talking about his cube when we get a chance here and there. And we're doing a Pack One Pick One from that cube. So if you want to play along at home, you know the drill. Just pause the podcast after I read all the cards. You decide what you would pick, and then unpause the podcast, and Anthony will tell you whether you're right or wrong. The cards are as follows. Fanatical Firebrand, Temple of Enlightenment. That's a rare. Heroic Reinforcements, Wandering Fumarole, also a rare. Springbloom Druid, Aerial Responder, Mist Meadow Witch, Jehessen Thief, Soul Herder, Tezzeret's Gambit, Ephemerate, Heraldic Banner, Thrashing Brontodon, Meadow Boon, and Rhythm of the Wild. And now that you've unpaused the podcast, Anthony, what are you looking at out of this pack?
I have no idea.
Do you really have no idea? You say that every week. Come on.
This week it's true. Just looking at this pack, there's a pretty flat power level. What really stands out to me first is that the gold cards are really, really appealing, especially Soul Herder and Rhythm of the Wild, and I guess Heroic Reinforcements as well. These are all pretty powerful cards in Pauper. I think
peasant.
They don't quite draw me in that much, though, so maybe Soul Herder would pull me in. But I'm a little bit more looking at Spring Bloom Druid and Tezzeret's Gambit, which is, you can basically consider a colorless card. So I think, yeah, maybe Tezzeret's Gambit, Spring Bloom Druid, and Soul Herder are kind of where I'm looking.
I'll look at the exact same places, Anthony. Great minds think alike.
Nice.
I also noted that the gold cards seemed pretty universally better than the rest of the pack, but to your point, there is a tension because are they enough better that I'm willing to go out on a limb and pick one a gold card? And we'll find out at the conclusion of this segment, but certainly all three of those cards I think are better than the monocolored or colorless options in the pack. So those are all jumping out at me. And again, Heroic Reinforcement, Soul Herder, and Rhythm of the Wild. And then I agree about Spring Bloom Druid. That card has really impressed me every time I get a chance to play it. Tezzeret's Gambit I think is cool, and I like that it's colorless, but I'm a little lower on it probably. I think I want to be reliably getting some value off of that proliferate before I'd be super excited about playing a Tezzeret's Gambit. So for me, it's really between those four cards, Spring Bloom Druid and the 3 gold cards.
Yeah, I think you're right about that, actually. Even though it is Phyrexian mana cost, so you can put it in any deck, which is pretty powerful if a deck wants a divination and isn't blue. It still is 3 mana, so it's still going to be a divination, which some environments that works really well, some environments it doesn't.
I gotta say, I think my evaluation of this card has been affected by playing it in the Turbo Cube, where it is disgusting.
This is one of the challenges of Cube, and I mean Magic in general, is that there's going to be a lot of crosstalk between your evaluations of cards in different contexts. And not that that's all bad. Like, if you were completely evaluating cards from scratch every time you saw them, that would be impossible. But it definitely does influence you here.
Yeah, I think it's important just to be aware of it. And I did when I first looked at the pack, I was like, ooh, Tezzeret's Gambit. Then I was like, wait a minute. Is that card actually good? Because I know it's really good.
More than 1 mana.
I know it's really good when it costs 1 mana and draws me 2 cards, and also most of those cards I can play for 0 mana and do a bunch of broken stuff. But is it good here? I don't know. I mean, it's not far off. I do agree that it's colorless, and I do think I've played this cube with Alex a few times, and card advantage is an important axis here, which, I mean, it's not true of all cubes. Some cubes lean much harder into the sort of tempo axis. So it's not completely out of contention, but I think given the other cards in the pack, we have better options.
Yeah, I think based on everything you're saying, I kind of like leaning towards Spring Bloom Druid, especially because if there are going to be a lot of really powerful gold cards, being able to just start in, base green and be able to splash them with what is really excellent fixing is probably going to be a strong way to start.
I'm going to take Soul Herder, which this is the second time I think I've taken Soul Herder from the listener-submitted pack. And I think the card just stands out in environments like this. I do think it's enough better than the other options in the pack that I'm willing to commit to a gold card. It's also a card I'm pretty happy to splash. Even though it costs 3 mana, it's perfectly defensible later on in the game. Like, playing it on turn 5 or 6 could be great if you get to immediately flicker something for value. So I could splash this in a green-white or green-blue deck or something. I think it's worth it, so I'm going to take that. It's also worth noting that, in this cube, we don't have an overabundance of removal in this exact pack. The only thing I can get rid of a Soul Herder is a Fanatical Firebrand, which would be hilarious if that actually happened. Yeah, I just think that the ceiling on Soul Herder is just sky high, and so I'm really excited to take something that I can kind of build my whole deck around, and it can take over a game in which it resolves.
I think that's reasonable, but I'm going to stick with the Spring Bloom Druid. Maybe
you'll wheel the Soul Herder.
Man, Modern Horizons was just a great set. Both these cards I really, really love.
That's true, yeah. They're both Modern Horizons cards. Got Ephemerate.
How do you rate Rhythm of the Wild? I feel like it's actually pretty close to Soul Herder.
So, Rhythm of the Wild is very good. It falls into this category of cards we've talked about a couple of times, which is that I need the rest of my deck to be good for Rhythm of the Wild to be good. True. Where I think Soul Herder is oftentimes the thing that makes your deck good. The rest of your deck can be pretty forgettable, but then all of a sudden Soul Herder turns every card into a repeatable value engine, and it just completely changes the context in which your deck is evaluated. Rhythm of the Wild is a really great way to turbo up a otherwise good mid-range or aggressive deck and make it that much better, but I am less confident pick one-ing a Rhythm of the Wild that I will get there on a deck that really wants Rhythm of the Wild, because am I going to splash for it? Maybe. Probably less likely than something like Soul Herder. So yeah, I'm just a little lower on it on pick one. But I do think on power level, like I said, it is enough above this pack that if I had taken a couple red cards before this pack and then I was looking at a Rhythm of the Wild, I'd be very drawn to it, I think.
Yeah, you do want it to be in play before you start casting your creatures, so it makes it much worse of a splash.
That's a really important detail, I think, about gold card evaluation that I think some players often miss, is that if your gold card is really only good on curve, even if you're not splashing it, even if you're just actually a 2-color deck, that makes it a lot worse as a gold card. It's just a lot less good if you need to get it in play early for it to be relevant, because even in a straight 2-color deck, your mana fixing is not always going to be perfect. We're drafting these decks, so we're not going to have excellent mana fixing most of the time. And so if you're waiting to get your red to put your Rhythm of the Wild in play, it's going to be a very low impact late game play. So
Fair enough.
all right, Anthony's taking this cool granola spring bloom druid guy. He looks like he listens to jam bands and smokes weed. And I'm taking this large, skinny, what's the shit? Yeah, but what's the?
Oh, you gotta bleep that. That's copyrighted.
Who's the movie director that makes the Halloween movie with the
Tim Burton?
Tim Burton, thank you. This is like real Tim Burton looking creeper.
I love it.
That's what I'm gonna
I'll
take.
also say I do really love to see the rare lands in this cube. I like Pauper. I keep mixing it up. Peasant can be a ton of fun, but I think that as much as that sort of constraint can breed a lot of creativity, I think it's also good to be aware of the fact that these lands are rare for reasons that are pretty different than why we have commons and rares and uncommons in a lot of other types of cards. So including them, I think, will just enhance the gameplay. I don't think it's taking any of that sort of Pauper essence away from it. Peasant.
Every time. Yeah, we didn't mention the lands, but they are not far from consideration for me. I mentioned those 4 cards, and then the next cards I'm looking at are probably Fumarole or Enlightenment. I don't love starting on just a straight 2-color land for reasons we've talked about, but for example, had I taken Soul Herder, pack one, pick one, and then I was past any 2-colored land that was either white or blue, I would be very inclined to take it right after this, unless there was an extremely good card in the pack. As soon as I have any kind of direction that I'm going, I take the lands very, very highly. But just totally blind, taking a blue-white duel or a blue-red duel and then not knowing if I'm going to be past nothing but black-green cards, it just feels kind of bad.
Yeah. I'll go in blind and assume that they are basically gold cards. I'm assuming I'm gonna be playing
Correct.
a 2-color deck, maybe with some splashing. So I'm only gonna be playing Wandering Fumarole if I'm playing exactly blue-red. If I'm a little bit more familiar with the cube and I know just doing 4 or 5 color nonsense is a possibility, then just starting with lands and just then figuring out what the best cards are you can play is also a strategy. But that's not where I'm excited to start.
Yeah, even if I end up playing 4 or 5 color nonsense, though, I think I'm still taking Soul Herder. That's the reason to be a 4 or 5 color nonsense deck. I could go Soul Herder into a black-green duel and still play a 4 or 5 color nonsense deck, but I think I want that Soul Herder because that's the whole reason I'm doing it, right?
For sure.
Okay, here's what I want to do. I want to take Soul Herder, then just take a bunch of lands, and then wheel that Rhythm of the Wild. Everything comes back into play, puts additional counters on it. Be disgusting. Be so fun.
I think we're just at Thanksgiving yet, but you're jumping the gun a bit.
What?
You're going right to Magical Christmas Land.
Oh, Dad. God. All right, thank you, Alex, for sending in your Pack One, Pick One. If you want to have your cube featured on Lucky Paper Radio, that can happen for you. Just email it to mail@luckypaper.co and include a link to it, your name, your pronouns, however you want to be credited. We'll put it on our spreadsheet. I got a lot of emails in my inbox I have not responded to, but I'm going to go down the list and give everybody a little thumbs up so you know I've gotten your email from you. But if you haven't heard back, if you send it in and it feels like you just shouted into the void, I promise. I'm keeping track of them all. I swear to you. Anthony.
Andy.
We're talking about EDH Cube tonight, and I think we need to start with a bit of a disclaimer. And that disclaimer is that neither you nor I have ever built an EDH Cube, unless you're moonlighting in some way that I'm unaware of.
I'm not. But I think that the point that I would want to make is just to say, we're not here to tell you exactly how you should build an EDH Cube. We're just sharing sort of our opinion on what these two formats have in common, how they work, how we would approach this. So just one data point, take it for what it's worth.
I also think, we have not built EDH cubes per se, but you and I together have built a lot of cubes, and so we've been through this process a lot of times, and I think we can offer some good perspective on how you might approach designing a novel environment of any kind through the example of looking at what we might do with an EDH cube. And my hope is, of course, this is useful. I really hope that this is reaching some people out there that are trying to build their first cube because they loved Commander Legends and they've somehow found our podcast, and I hope we can help you out. I also hope for all of our regular listeners that I know already have cubes, most of which I know aren't EDH cubes. I hope that we still touch on some high-level design theory stuff that is helpful for everybody. So that is our goal. I think we should just start with the details of multiplayer play, Anthony. I know this is a topic you were interested in covering, maybe not even directly associated with EDH or EDH cubes, but let's just start there. How do you approach an environment differently if you expect to play it multiplayer?
Yeah, I mean, I think that even though multiplayer isn't my preferred way to play most of the time, although it's great occasionally, it's still a really interesting sort of just game theory question to try and tackle. How does it shape the game? How does it change your card choices as a player? And then as a cube designer, how would you change the actual cards that the choices that your players have to make? So the biggest difference, obviously, is it just defense is so much more valued in multiplayer than offense. If you're playing against one other opponent, you know their life total. You have to get them to 0 before they get you to 0. If you're playing in multiplayer, if you attack someone, you're vulnerable now. And attacking just one of your players doesn't mean, in this zero-sum game, you've done 10 damage to them, you're up 10 points. If you and one of your opponents actually traded 10 damage back and forth, you're actually both disadvantaged against the whole table. So that's the core, biggest, hugest thing about multiplayer Magic is if you're playing with let's call it just like all the cards before they started printing cards, more specifically for multiplayer especially, you're going to just find that being on defense is often where you're going to find yourself.
And that's not just with regards to combat, I should say. That also is with regards to targeted removal, counter spells. Like, you consider it an aggressive play to, remove an opponent's blocker to allow you to attack in, or to, proactively remove one of their things. And if you imagine a multiplayer game, this is well-trod territory for anybody experienced with EDH, but it's worth reiterating. If you imagine a multiplayer game, you've got 3 players, and player A, use a removal spell to destroy player B's key permanent. The person that got out best in that transaction is player C, who did nothing, and both their opponents are down a card. One of their opponents is, down one of their important permanents. That person is the one who comes out most advantage in that interaction. And so for that reason, it's not to say that target removal is not good in multiplayer. It certainly is, because sometimes it keeps you from dying. But the politics of the game, the way that it plays out, is often this kind of game of chicken where nobody wants to be the one to spend their resources to stop any given opponent. And so it's defensive in that sense too. Everybody's just trying to build up their own resources and protect their own resources at the cost of riding that razor's edge.
And then there's just a ton of other sort of knock-on effects that happen. So once we say all of these one-on-one interactions, combat included, are a little bit less valuable, now it just means that the entire game starts to slow down a little bit, meaning your early plays are not so much about just trying to get a defensive position, to deal with an aggressive deck, or to be in an aggressive position yourself, and instead it's more just about developing your board. When I say it's more about that, I mean that is the optimal strategy.
Right.
And that really cascades into sort of how multiplayer Magic, and, Commander is the biggest, most prominent version of that, ends up playing out. That the early turns are so much about developing your own position, making sure you have a position against other players in the late game, and then often win conditions that are not strictly about combat, but are alternate win conditions. Because if you can just win, that is so much more powerful than trying to make multiple other opponents lose.
And it should be noted, we have not played an EDH Cube, as we mentioned, but you and I think, have played a lot of EDH. EDH was our format that I think took us from maybe very casually flirting with the idea of playing Magic to being very enfranchised Magic players, which over the course of, 3 years or so, that was the only format we really played, and we played a lot, multiple games a week, and you and I have both built dozens of EDH decks and been involved in lots of games. So we have a very good sense of what EDH is, even though you or I don't play a ton anymore because we found our new favorite friend, Cube. But yeah, we do certainly know what those games end up looking like and feeling like. And yes, to your point, Anthony, it's a format where aggressive 1-drops are not a thing, aggressive 2-drops are not a thing, aggressive 3-drops are not a thing, and every form of 2 and 3 mana ramp is extremely playable in every color pair. So you are rewarded for planning for the long game, building up resources, and basically working kind of within your own sphere of influence, which I think is something that also serves in some ways to simplify a multiplayer game. You know, like one-on-one Magic is complicated when you just look at what your opponent's doing, what you're doing, trying to make optimal choices. You know, I make some kind of punt in basically every game I play, pretty much. Like some kind of mistake, whether it was an obvious mistake or a very nuanced mistake that, you know, I wouldn't have caught without a lot of careful reflection. And in a multiplayer game with, you know, way more permanence, more variables and things like that, it can be very hard to make optimal plays. And so if you're not playing sort of the CEDH level of Commander, the idea that your deck is mostly about your deck functioning within itself and just building up its own resources also makes it more playable because it limits how much you have to think about what your opponents are doing. You're just kind of each building up your own little castle, and maybe one player's castle is getting a little too big, and you know you agree that we need to use some removal spells over there and you know get rid of some problematic permanents, but it's a very different kind of way of understanding the tempo of the game than a one-on-one game of Magic, which is zero-sum. You're just trying to get your opponent dead, and if that involves sacrificing all of your permanents, it doesn't matter as long as your opponent's dead. But in multiplayer Magic, you can't afford to do that unless you're going to kill all of your opponents.
Yeah, that's a great point, and related to what you were saying earlier as well. I think it's worth emphasizing we don't want to say this is a bad thing. There's a reason that EDH was such a wonderful format to sort of like get us into the game, because it really is about exploring what the game can do, exploring like how am I going to build my collection? What are the things that are going to be exciting to me? How do I build a deck that really reflects what's interesting about the game to me? And then the downside of that is that I think eventually we sort of found like, well, it's kind of fun to sort of do your own thing, and then someone rests the board, and then you kind of try and build up, and then someone rests the board. But there's a level of sort of strategic play that Limited and Cube offer that just also is very appealing to us.
Yeah, and I think too, at least a lot of what got me into EDH, and I think accounts for a lot of its popularity, is some very beneficial practical details of it. So one of them is that I think for a lot of players that are not very enfranchised, they want to play with their cards. And if their cards rotate out of standard, it's like a big feel bad. And so the idea that, you know, there is a ban list in Commander, but it's relatively small and it changes very infrequently. And so any card you have pretty much in your collection, you can put in your Commander deck. And I think that's very appealing to people that are not trying to do the grind of some competitive constructed format. And then the other detail about that is that multiplayer means that there is a much greater acceptance for variable power level between the decks. If we are playing Modern, or we're playing Pioneer, or whatever constructed format, and you have a, you know, tier 1 deck with all of the best cards that you shelled out for, and I have my brew that I tried to put together based on the cards I happen to have in my collection, chances are the matchup's going to be pretty favored for you. You're just going to stop me with your good Modern deck, and I'm going to be trying to assemble these wins, and it's just not going to work out for me. And that's not really fun for either of us. It's not fun for you to just run over some off-meta deck, and it's not fun for me to lose constantly. And what Commander does, largely because of multiplayer, is it says that, well, if you sit down and one player's deck is twice as good as everyone else's deck, well, guess what? They're going to obviously be in the lead, and their opponents can use politics to try and, you know, cut them back down. Maybe it turns into a, you know, 2v1 situation just naturally because that person's deck is better. And that means that there's a much greater ability to just play with anybody. And to me, I think those two factors account for a lot of Commander's success, that you can play with your cards and you can play with almost anybody. I mean, there's still that social contract thing of there are definitely CEDH decks that will just blow away a table full of casual decks, but there's a very wide band of power level that can have fun games with each other.
For sure. I remember so viscerally when we tried to play, was it Modern technically? I don't know.
I did have
packs.
A technically Modern deck for a while there, yes.
We cracked some packs, built some decks, and I remember showing my deck to a more enfranchised player, and I was so excited about my Gerard Golgari Lich Lord, and I had sort of tried to build this deck around it. And they're like, yeah, this card's pretty good in your deck. Why do you only have one of them? And I'm like, well, I only opened one. What am I supposed to do? And then, sure, I could go out and say, like, okay, well, now I have to go buy 4 of these cards and build this whatever constructed deck. Or Commander was just this option to say, like, hey, if you open a single of a card, you can just put it in your deck and you're done. And it made sort of the experience of collecting so much more fun.
Yeah, one of my, right around when Origins came out, we were getting more and more into Magic, and that's when we were playing our, like, quote-unquote modern games, because I think just the cards we had access to, we couldn't play Standard, and so we were like, well, I guess Modern's the next best thing, is, you know, the next legality level. But again, we were all very casual and didn't have a sense of what the modern decks were, and I built this really janky Bant control deck whose only win condition was Mana Gorger Hydra, and that was why I was playing green. It was basically a blue-white control deck, but I really liked Mana Gorger Hydra, and so I was playing that as my win condition.
And we hated it. Imagine playing against Mana Gorger Hydra when you haven't discovered that Doomblade is good yet.
When you didn't know you should run removal, and you're like, this thing just keeps getting bigger, and it's got trample, that's not fair.
How could you ever beat that?
And of course, the idea of Mana Gorger Hydra ever being viable in a format with Lightning Bolt and Path to Exile is laughable, but, at the time, that's what we were doing, and Commander was a very appealing option for us, and that is really what I think accelerated you and I and some of the other players in our play group into getting very invested in Magic, to the point where I even knew Cube was a thing. I didn't know what the top-tier modern decks were. I definitely did not know what Cube was, or that it was an option at that time, so...
and I don't know if it would have appealed to us in the same way. Like you said, everyone sort of exploring what was interesting to them about the game and building their own decks is a huge thing. And I think that just saying here, play my cube, that's about what I enjoy about the game. If you're not very enfranchised, that's not a huge appealing sell.
You'd be like, where are my Mana Gorger Hydras?
It's in the Turbo Cube.
Yeah, it's a really fun card. I still really like it emotionally, partially because it was part of that deck that I had for a while, but also because it's just a very cool card. It's a shame it's not great. I think what you're trying to get at, Anthony, is that if you or I were to approach building a Commander cube, we really want to ask this core question of what is it about Commander that you are trying to capture? Because I think the answer to that question can vary dramatically depending on who we're talking to and who's listening, and also will have a very sizable impact on the decisions made about this hypothetical cube and the direction it goes down.
So I think there's almost two separate aspects to this. One aspect is just that multiplayer games are extremely different. Like what your draft strategy is going to be, what your strategy during the games is going to be extremely different. Have you ever actually played your cube in multiplayer games?
Maybe once or twice. We only had like 3 people and we decided to do a kind of free-for-all, but really no, but basically not. I mean, usually if I have an odd number of people, we'll just, even if we have 3, we'll all 3 of us will draft, and then we'll just take turns playing matches with somebody watching, because it's really not designed for multiplayer in any sense.
Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting to do when you have a cube that's not designed for multiplayer, because your card evaluations just change wildly, and you end up with these pretty weird decks that are pretty stretching for playables, but it's still a fun game. So yeah, one aspect is just that multiplayer play is very different, and honestly, I think that's, the bulk of the difference between Commander and some other, singleton constructed format is just that you're playing multiplayer, so the strategy is going to be so different.
I'm operating from an assumption that is core to the idea of a Commander cube, which might not be for you. If you're listening and you're like, I love Commander and I'm interested in cube, but the multiplayer thing is not what I love about Commander, then I think you have a lot more options available to you. My notes I've made here and sort of prepared for this episode are all assuming that multiplayer is core to the idea of a Commander cube.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I don't know if we can emphasize this enough. Magic is a spectrum. You can play in all kinds of ways, and we don't want to, label people and put people into a bucket and say, oh, you're a Commander player, you must be playing multiplayer.
It's a spectrum from my awesome, really cool, sexy cube to your, dumb and bad cube. No, I'm just kidding. How do we get, a fun, ribbing, vibe on the show? Some of my favorite podcasts, the hosts always are ribbing each other. How do we make that happen?
You just gotta be meaner.
I was just a little mean, and I felt bad about it.
Oh, okay. When we talk about the when we talk about your other cube,
don't speak its name. Don't speak its name yet. In a couple of weeks, you can roast the hell out of it, though.
Okay, great. The other thing that I think is pretty different is that, or pretty specific to EDH, is that there is this really sort of defined expectation of what kinds of cards you're going to play. So I thought it was really interesting. If you haven't listened to it already, I would definitely recommend listening to the interview with Gavin Verhey on Solely Singleton. I thought it was very interesting, and one of the things that he emphasized a lot was there are cards players expect to see, and if they sit down at their Commander Cube draft and they don't see their Cultivate and their Kodama's Reach and their Rampant Growth, I'm just naming the green cards, but I'm sure people play Commander in other colors as well, it's just not going to feel like Commander to people. And I think that that's something that I just have to really, force against my instinct a little bit to accept that. Because to me, it's what kind of decisions am I making? What kind of strategy is working versus not working is what really defines a format to me. But I also totally get that the actual cards that you can play is really important to a lot of people.
And that's why I think the first question people need to ask is, what is it about Commander that you like and are trying to capture? And for some people, it might be that my friends and I have playing with these suite of cards for a long time, these staples in this format, and we have emotional relationships with them. And, there's stories about that one time that Debbie cast Cultivate and, got a guy's cradle and no one realized and lol or whatever. If that is what you like about Commander, then that should guide your choices. And to be totally clear, the first version of my cube was completely dictated by me just wanting to play literal physical cards. I was like, I want to play opposition. I want to play upheaval. I want to play balance. These cards are banned or bad in Commander. And so that was one of the reasons I started a cube in the first place. So it's totally, completely viable to just say, want to play with these cards. That is my driving factor, and use that to basically as a starting point to design your cube.
A starting point? I'm still there. It's the only place that I can play White Mane Lion, and it's still not great in my cube.
You play in your battle box. That's a different place.
And in battle box, true.
It's pretty good there. I want to direct people to an article we published on Lucky Paper a couple weeks ago in partnership with Land of Mordor, who you may know from various cube circles, always contributing to the discourse in a positive way. And the article is titled The First 4 Questions Cube Designers Should Ask, and I will link it in the show notes. And I think it's a really good framework for how you ought to think about the early decisions you make around designing a cube. And like I said, for me, I think the core question here is, what is it you like about Commander, and what are you trying to capture? And so I've answered those questions for me, and I'm interested in kind of running down how I would approach designing a Commander cube, and then Anthony, maybe you could do the same or roast my decisions. I think it's really kind of the first question is, how am I going to, what's actually valuable to me I'm trying to capture? I think that's the third question, actually, in the actual article. But anyway, it's a very important one to ask early on. And so, again, we've talked about the multiplayer nature, which I'm operating at the assumption that is core to the identity of a Commander cube. So I'm going to stick with that. In addition to the practical things we've talked about for why EDH is successful, I think another defining feature of the format is this very unique combination of high variance from the fact that it's 100-card singleton, it's got a gigantic card pool, it's got color identity, which limits the cards you can run in each deck, which basically effectively broadens the number of playable cards in the format. And then also low variance because you have consistent access to this one card, or cards if you have multiple commanders, in the command zone, which actually also has the effect of making the card pool that's viable broader because, there's a lot of cards that you end up playing in Commander because they're good with your commander that if you didn't have access to that consistent card from the command zone every game, that other card would not be playable in 100-card singleton. It would be too narrow to actually work. And so there's this really interesting deck construction, which I think is very successful and really contributes to why Commander is fun to play, because you have 100 cards in your deck, 99 cards in your deck, so games are not the same. Every game you see a different combination of those cards, and they play out kind of differently. But you do have this anchor, the actual commander there, that is trying to give some consistency across multiple games, and more importantly, give your deck a coherent strategy, even though it's a 100-card singleton deck, which, if you're working on a budget or from a sort of limited card pool, I think it can be hard to make a 100-card singleton deck that has a coherent strategy if you don't have that sort of aspect that is adding to that consistency from the command zone. So that's,
it's definitely more limiting. You're going to find certain optimal strategies, because that's a format, right? Isn't it Canadian Highlander?
Canadian Highlander is a 100-card singleton format that operates on a different system. Instead of a ban list, they have a point list. So you actually can literally play any card except for Conspiracies and Shahrazad and stuff. But you can play Black Lotus in Canadian Highlander. It just uses up half your points or whatever that you're allowed to allot to powerful cards. So yeah, that is a format. And it's actually a format I've thought a lot about. But I think one of the reasons that it maybe has not taken off to the degree that EDH has is because it is a little harder to access because of this reason. It doesn't have this flavorful and mechanical anchor of the actual commander, which I think brings a lot of people in and also gets those gears turning in the head of somebody that's maybe designing one of their first decks of ooh, if I have this card all the time, then this card becomes good. And they start to think about synergies and combos in ways that maybe you wouldn't otherwise in just a regular big singleton deck.
Totally. It's I love Gilder Baron. He's such a cute little guy, but it doesn't really make sense. But I have this one commander that cares so much about 1/1 counters and gets to tap and untap stuff. So here's the one perfect spot that can really find a home for this pet card.
Right. So of all these aspects of Commander, I should say the one other thing I have noted here is just that I find that Commander games, and we touched on this a little bit with the prioritization of defense over offense, but I find that Commander games tend to be very long. I mean, they're multiplayer, you have a higher life total, for all those reasons, the games tend to be very drawn out. And of all of these factors of Commander, I am interested in pursuing and playing with the idea of that variance. Like, how do we have both high variance and also low variance kind of intermixed in this very interesting way, but keeping the games shorter and not sort of super drawn out, maybe trying as much as possible to prioritize aggressive strategies and make it a good incentive to attack instead of just like letting everybody build up their own defensive strategies. So I think most of the mechanical decisions around what commander is, the fact that it's a 100-card singleton, the fact that you have a commander in the command zone, the fact that there is color identity, you can't play a red card in your blue-white deck. All of these factors, I think, are to make Commander a diverse format where it is diverse from deck to deck and it's diverse from game to game. And frankly, I think that a lot of those things kind of butt up against or are redundant with the idea of just drafting, period. Drafting from a pool of cards is going to make your decks diverse and it's going to make your games very diverse because you're just gonna draft again and you're gonna have a whole new deck. And so a lot of those things that are core to what Commander is mechanically, I don't really see a need for in a drafted environment like Cube, personally.
All right, jumping right into gripes.
I'm not
I
griping
think you're
at all.
totally right. I think we can
To be
go
clear,
down the
I'm
list.
not griping. Like these are things I think make the constructed format great, and they are just not necessary, I think, in a drafted format. And I think that a lot of the people that have built EDH cubes are totally understandably working from a place of familiarity with the format. And so they're like, how do I capture this format in Cube? And so the start is like, well, how do I deal with color identity if it's drafted? How do I, deal with commanders? Maybe there's a separate pack at the beginning. Maybe I have to make people draft commanders like they do in Commander Legends. And for me, if I was pursuing this, I would probably jettison all of that and just say it's a multiplayer format. And I have some other ideas I'll get to in a bit, but just say, don't worry about color identity because you already have to draft your deck. So if you can play all the cards, like by all means, go for it. And then I'll get to a little bit about what I would do, I think, with the actual commanders, which I would still want to include in the actual draft itself. But yeah, I think that a lot of those things are accomplished just by drafting.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, all of these things we've talked about that are mechanical differences between quote-unquote normal Magic and Commander serve a really important point to open up and diversify options for deck building, to like really make your collection, work for you and get a lot of value out of your collection, and have this sort of like fun, casual multiplayer experience. And I totally agree that I think that in a limited environment, those things are already solved. So to say, well, let's now add the fact that you need a commander, well, the fact that I'm drafting, name a commander.
Golos.
Golos? No, I'm going to go with Yawgmoth. The fact that I've drafted Yawgmoth...
Why'd you even ask me to, then?
I had to think about it.
Rude.
I had to turn around and look at my decks. When I'm building a commander deck, I can start with Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, wonderful Magic card, would recommend, and then explore the depth of everything that Magic has to offer and try and figure out what are the cards that really work best with this. When I'm drafting a cube, I'm already trying to solve all these interesting problems, and I'm working from this limited card pool. I'm not really getting that same experience as a player. But on the other hand, as a cube designer, I absolutely get that experience because I want to say, I love White Mane Lion. How do I design a cube that is really balanced around that in a way that it is the right amount of power level, has an interesting interplay in the draft with enough different cards? So I really feel like Commander is wonderful, but everything that the actual Commander itself activates in the constructed format, it doesn't necessarily do the same thing for me personally in a cube environment.
I think you're right. If you look at the process of drafting and you look at the process of designing a cube, that kind of, those two pieces together comprehensively, I think, cover all the things that are great about EDH, pretty much, especially if you're talking about a multiplayer cube. I would be interested, if I were to do this, I understand your argument for like why the commanders maybe aren't even necessary, but I think the point for me of like pursuing a commander cube would be to try and figure out how that idea could still work in a multiplayer format, in a drafted format. And my first thoughts were, I think I mentioned, just ignore color identity. You have to draft, so there's already a pressure on the cards you can put in your deck that is not related to something arbitrary like color identity. Not arbitrary, but something outside of the actual game like color identity. What if we just said your players could make any creature they drafted their commander? Like, forget legends, forget all that kind of stuff. You can take any creature you draft and start it outside of the game. Like, what does that do? Or, let's go a little further. What if you could have any permanent you drafted or any card you drafted as your commander in your deck, have access to it from the command zone? So, there's a format Oathbreaker, which I think you're familiar with, Anthony, which allows you to run a Planeswalker and a color identity matching sorcery, I think, or maybe it's an Earth sorcery that matches that card, which allows you to sort of have 2 cards in the command zone. That would open up all of the same diversity of weird combos and interactions that you get from Commander, where you can take a card that is maybe fine in your main deck, but if you actually make it your commander of your deck, maybe it's ephemerate, right? And you build a blink deck around it, or whatever. I think it could potentially open up a lot of interesting avenues for drafting and deck building. And I think it's important here that we also talk about the advantages we have as a cube designer over working with a constructed format, because if they were to say any card could be your commander in Commander, they'd have to ban another 150 cards tomorrow, probably, right? It would totally change the format in a way that would be very confusing. I think there's other reasons they don't do that, I think. There's flavor to the fact that it has to be a legend and all that kind of stuff. But because there's an enormous card pool available for constructed, it becomes very problematic to open things up like this. But you're making the cube. Just don't put any cards in it that will be broken as a commander, right? Or make sure they're all equally, the power levels distributed pretty evenly. So there's not any ones that are big spikes above other ones. And I'd be curious to know how that would play out. And I might try that first, for example, if I was trying to capture the spirit of Commander in a drafted environment.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's definitely a lot of weird things that are tied up here between sort of the flavor of the game and the actual mechanics of it. Legendary, do you even have a good sense of why it was originally designed that way? I would say it was designed as another way to sort of put a downside on a card so that they could make it more powerful. But some of the original legends were not especially powerful, so maybe that's not totally the case.
You mean why Magic R&D even invented the idea of legendary cards?
It's definitely in let's say pre-Commander, but in later design, was definitely used in that way as sort of a drawback mechanic to let them make these sort of big, splashy, flavorful cards.
It definitely is now, and I do know there was a time in constructed Magic history where if it was a legendary card, you could only have 1 copy in your deck.
Right, they were initially actually just restricted. So then I think it was awesome to say, okay, well, we want to make this format that's about the flavor of, I have this character that's leading my army, to say, well, I'm going to take one of these characters, which isn't just an Ication Javelineer. It is the creature. Yawgmoth. I should have written down some fun.
I just imagine you've got your whole computer laid out, and you've got a post-it note on the wall that says Yawgmoth on it, and it's just circled.
Pretty much.
That one guy we like.
I'm sure there are other legendary creatures.
Frenzo Havoc Razor is my favorite commander deck at the moment.
But it's so much more flavorful to say, this legendary creature, which, as Magic was designed, already sort of has this story and is an individual, is leading my army. But since then, if it's just used as a mechanic to be a drawback mechanic to let them balance the game itself, it doesn't really make as much sense when it's they happen to not make this one card that has this really interesting synergistic mechanic not legendary. It sucks that I now can't play it in my commander.
Right.
I'm sorry,
and there's people that
commander.
have been playing Taminoa and the Nephilim as commanders, unofficially for a long time, because those cards are cards that feel like they belong at the helm of a synergistic deck, but just happen to not be legendary, right?
And I think that tension is not actually totally productive. I think it makes, because making a creature legendary makes it better in Commander in some ways, because it isn't a drawback, because it's a singleton format, but it makes it worse in Constructed because you can only have one of them in play. And I think that tension is not actually productive to the game, because these are different formats. They literally don't relate to them, so it's relate to each other. So it's just a tension that when R&D is designing a Magic card, they have to choose between, are we thinking about Commander players or are we thinking about Constructed players, because there's this sort of weird interplay. I know one that comes to mind a lot is Earl of Squirrel, which is also a silver bordered card, but hey, we should do whatever we want. People were, a little bit upset that it wasn't legendary because they want to play it as their commander, but Mark Rosewater legitimately wants people to play, their fun kitchen table decks where they have 4 copies of Earl of Squirrel because it's great in multiples. So I think that that's actually one of the things that is really, really great about thinking about a Commander Cube, is that because it's a completely custom format, you can do whatever you want. You aren't worrying about saying, well, I'm going to build this deck where I have, Earl of Squirrel as my commander, even though he's silver bordered and not legendary. And hopefully the people at my LGS will be okay with that. Instead, you're saying, well, here's the cube. All creatures can be commanders, and that's fine.
Yeah, and we are venturing pretty far from what Commander is to most players, and so it's worth noting that if one of the reasons you're interested in making a Commander cube is because of the familiarity with your playgroup, they will know what it is, and you don't have to explain things to them, and maybe it's even something that makes it appealing for them to draft because they all know they like Commander, then you might want to avoid all this because you're like, look, I have a playgroup that loves Commander, they love their legendary cards. If I have to explain all these different rules modifications, it no longer feels like Commander, right? It feels like this thing I made up that now all my friends are like, why are we playing Dave's format? Dave's format's weird. And that's totally reasonable. But I think if you're trying to capture the spirit of what makes EDH great for a lot of players, at least for Anthony and I, as we're describing here, then doing something more radical like this, I would not shy away from. I think, Anthony, there is a reluctance among many players, myself included, to do something perceived as radical. I think because people are afraid of failing, right? They're afraid of, like, they know Magic is fun, and so they're like kind of like hold on to that little nugget of wisdom and goodness and say, all right, Magic is good, now let me try and like make a way to play Magic without somehow ruining the fact that Magic is good. And that's kept me from doing things before. Like I mentioned on the last show when Daniel first built his gold cube that I was like, this sounds kind of like a train wreck. Like I honestly had the feeling when Daniel started explaining his gold cube, like, Daniel's going to take what's good about Magic and ruin it and make Magic not fun for anybody. And as we
start listening to the podcast now, you have to be careful.
No, I mean, I said it to Daniel at the time. He knows this. But as we established, Daniel's cube was incredible, and I immediately felt stupid for, like, not only for kind of judging it in my head a little bit before playing it, but also for all of my years spent, like, working on my own cube and never having the guts to be like, everybody gets a Pillar of the Parents, and I'm running these ridiculous cards because I was afraid of somehow doing something wrong or, like, messing it up. And I think over the past, like, 12 or 18 months, you and I and other people in our playgroup have gotten more experimental and more radical with the cubes we're building. I mean, we talked about the Turbo Cube, we've talked about the Mono Black Cube, we'll talk about my other cube project, which is, suffice it to say, very radical and pushed to an extreme. And in all of these environments, I've just found more rewarding things about Magic at each corner. I've never, like, gone down one of these roads and been like, well, there it is, we've ruined Magic. Like, it just, you can't really do it. So if you have any of those feelings of like, ooh, I'm just a little afraid to try something off the beaten path because it might ruin it, it might not be fun, I would say ignore that feeling as much as you can. And if you do push it too far, you can always rein it in. But if you don't push it far enough, then you never really know how much further to push it, right? There's a dumb saying, which I think I heard on a podcast once, and I've tried to find a source to attribute this to, and I can't. And so if someone knows the canonical source for this quote, let me know. But it's a quote that basically goes that, you know, if you're in war and you shoot a mortar at your opponent, right? So you've got these, like, you know, battlefields and you're launching this big arcing warhead over to the enemy lines. If the first mortar misses short, your next mortar sure as hell better miss long, right? And what the idea of this anecdote is that if you're trying to, like, dial in something just right and you don't go far enough the first time, if you just make it a little bit further, but you still don't go far enough, then you have way less information about what is far enough than if you way overshot it. And so the idea of being more willing to be radical in different directions will help you more quickly figure out where the comfortable center is for you and your values and where you want to be.
I agree, but I'll push back a little bit and say that as much as I would love to encourage both cube designers and their playgroups, cube players, to be willing to be more radical, if you're a cube designer, your players might just not be interested in that. Like, even just playing, you know, something that is as radical as, or as not radical as just a lower powered cube, it's honestly been a little bit of an uphill battle to convince a lot of people that it is still a serious format that you can try and optimize and have fun with, let alone than saying, let's take the Turbo Cube seriously, where everything costs 2 less and we're going to do wacky stuff.
And it's been an uphill battle for me to get you to draft my cube project, so yeah.
Well, there might be, you know, more legitimate, like, mechanical reasons why I don't enjoy that gameplay than just not taking it seriously. So, and that's totally another point that Gavin made on Solely Singleton that I legitimately, like, wasn't really considering as much, and I think is very valuable, that the draft is a little bit weird. There's some special rules, but after you're done with the draft, you're just playing Commander. All the rules that you're familiar with are there. And as much as that is less appealing to me, I totally get that as a product that is targeted entirely at Commander players, they want to just have that solid baseline where they're not trying to teach you something weird. So do weird things, but also figure out a way that you can engage your playgroup.
Right, and that's why I come back to that thing I said first, which is what is it about Commander that you are trying to capture? And
Right.
if you are trying to capture the familiarity, the nostalgia you have for the format that you know your playgroup loves, then you should adhere to as many of the core rules of the format as you can. And I think everything Gavin describes in that episode to me is like describing all the ways that Magic R&D tried to make Commander draftable while making as few structural changes to the format as
Right.
they possibly could. And that resulted in all these partner commanders, that resulted in all sorts of design decisions, 20 card packs that, you know, are all basically to try and make Commander draftable while making as few structural changes to it as they possibly could, because they, of course, they're trying to market this thing, right? And if they market it with a bunch of rules changes, then it's a whole other sort of complicated thing. So I think that's a good starting point, and it's worth thinking about. And depending on your own values and the tolerance of your playgroup for trying more radical and more interesting things, I might suggest throwing more of that out and just kind of finding a nice happy balance for you to test things out. I am kind of interested in the idea of designing some sort of cube where any card can be your commander in the command zone and what that would actually do. I mean, I have some ideas right off the top of my head of cards that'd be kind of messed up. Like just basically giving everybody a free demonic tutor every single game is pretty good, I think, probably. So I think that's worth considering. To that point, though, Anthony, I will say that if I were doing this, I would also just not go with an increased deck size. I would go with a 40-card deck size because I feel like drafting really big decks does get kind of cumbersome, and this has been Gavin talked about in the podcast as well, that even 20-card packs is pushing a little bit, but they were trying to strike this balance between bigger than 40-card, but they couldn't get to 100-card decks because it was too much to draft. So I would probably just say 40-card decks, any card can be your commander, and I would include lots of cards and mechanics that would encourage aggression to offset the natural defensive-ness of the format. Cards like Monarch, cards like... really, Monarch's the best example. Monarch and Goad, I think, are two really good mechanics for specifically pushing combat in a multiplayer game.
I think Myriad is another great example. There's only a couple
that's
cards,
true.
and they're not the most exciting cards, but I'd love to see more of that mechanic.
And of course, the new Unearth from Commander Legends
Oh yeah,
is
that also
very
has a
similar
similar
too.
effect. Yeah, I think that's another really good point. We didn't talk about that as sort of like one of the things that makes Commander unique and cool, but literally just the giant deck size. It's, for a lot of people, myself included, it's about the most cards that I can shuffle and still call it a deck. And it adds a really cool variation. You know, I can have my one deck that I love and have spent years building, and still have it play out differently every time because there's just so many cards and it is a singleton deck. And so for a lot of players, again, I think that feels very much like an important piece of the identity of Commander. And so when they move to Cube, they say, well, it has to have a 100-card deck because that's what Commander is like. And if that's what you enjoy, there's no reason you shouldn't do it. But I think you should also be willing to sort of find that the fact that you're drafting from a larger cube means you're already going to get that variation. And for me, if I draft a 100-card deck and then only play the top quarter of it, it feels like that other 75% of the draft just didn't really matter. So I'd be much happier just drafting a smaller deck. I still get that variation from the fact that I'm playing a new deck literally every time, and not have to either, you know, make the draft much longer and have a lot of it feel wasted and break my hands too much with shuffling.
Exactly. Yeah. So like I have a Goblin EDH deck that I really love with Grenzo the Havoc Razor because I do like Goad, and I like forcing my opponents that built their EDH decks to be these little pillow forty things where they just build up their own resources and then win the game in some arcane way. I like forcing them to attack with our little utility creatures. And in that deck, I just, playing against Hillary over the weekend, I just managed to finally assemble Shared Animosity with the new Krenko, the one that, you know, makes goblins equal to its power when it attacks. And the fact that I had to wait years since that card was printed to finally make that combo happen in a game and not have it be countered or removed or my opponents scoop immediately or whatever as soon as it starts happening is one of the fun things about the format. It gives that deck a lot of depth. And the equivalent to that in Cube is not, I have my 140 card deck I drafted once and I play it every other weekend and, you know, it's the same every single time. It's that I finally drafted these two cards together in the cube and I made this combo happen in a game. And it's like the same thing, but you can get there, like you said, with the much smaller deck size, which I think makes the draft much more engaging and exciting and less about like, well, if you're drafting 60 cards for your 100-card deck, and Gavin said this in the episode of Sully Singleton, then at a certain point you're locked into your colors and you're just, everyone's taking cards in their colors and there's no real signals anymore. You can't jump ship halfway through pack 4 of 6 and start drafting a new color if you're building a deck that big. And so really it's the early parts of the draft that are the most interesting. And the longer the draft goes on, the less interesting it is, I think.
Yeah. What I would say is that another reason to have bigger decks is because multiplayer format is likely to be slower compared to one-on-one games, you are going to just have longer games, which means you might end up just decking yourself more often. So I think that's a great reason to go from, 40 cards to 60 cards.
It's possible. I mean, I still think decking yourself with a 40-card deck is kind of impressive if you're not supporting mill or a bunch of really powerful card advantage and Xerox theory stuff, but that could be the case if you built it and found out that those games were just going really long.
So another thing that I thought was interesting that they talked about was, I think the specific phrase was just like, we have to find enough room to fit all the ramp and card draw that you need to build an EDH deck in Commander Legends. And to me, that seems sort of backwards. Again, I think it's really valuable if you're trying to get people to draft decks that look familiar and feel like the Commander decks that they're used to. But I think the fact that we can actually limit resources and make things scarce actually makes the format that much more interesting. So if you're playing a bunch of Commander and you're sort of seeing, well, I'm actually just kind of bored of everybody just spending literally the first, 3, 4, 5 turns just playing ramp spells and drawing cards, you could just not include those in the cube. And by making them a scarce resource, players have to try and find a new strategy that actually works. So again, I'm not surprised that was the right choice for them in Commander Legends, because they want to engage people that are used to playing this way and enjoy playing that way. But I think that as a cube designer, we also just have so many other knobs to twist to try and experiment with different kinds of gameplay.
And that just reminded me, we didn't mention this, but I also would keep starting life totals 20, and it sounds like you would probably do the same based on your own values.
That's a great point.
There's already enough of a natural lean towards defensiveness that I think doubling the life total just further, cuts down the viability of any aggressive combat-based strategy. And so I would just stick it with 20 and see how that played out before I made any changes to it. If
I have any real gripe, it's that sometimes the Commander community sets high expectations that Wizards needs to be designing cards for their format. And the format was invented by us, by players. We should make the format whatever we want it to be. And when people are frustrated that aggressive decks don't work, I just want to tell them that we're in control. We invented this the first time. If aggressive decks don't work, we can lower the life total, and they'll work again.
Yeah, I have no problem complaining about Magic players complaining about things. That's fine by me.
Magic players don't complain about things. If your invented format doesn't have the cards it needs, change your invented format.
Or, I don't even mind players expressing the cards they would like to see printed. What I really don't like is the sense of entitlement, where it's like, you have not printed a good white card for Commander in this many years. Like, what is wrong with you? How are you so blind to this? And it's like, well, actually, you're just refusing to play Armageddon and Ravages of War and all the cards that are white cards that will be really good in Commander, right, because they don't comport with your sort of social understanding of the game. And also, it's a fan-made format with completely different rules than regular Magic, so to complain that this color doesn't get, cards good enough for it and feel entitled to them is the thing that really gets me. If you want to ask Mark Rosewater all day to print whatever card you want, great. But if you're going to act like you are owed it, that's where I start to roll my eyes right out of my head at you.
For sure. Yeah, and the other point, now I'm just going to go into a rant, but...
Pop off, King. Do it.
I hear players sometimes, they'll say, well, specifically, white is bad in Commander. And then they'll say, well, every other card gets everything they need. Blue has Pongify and Rapid Hybridization. Green has Beast Within and, what is this, Song of the Dryads, am I remembering correctly?
That one turns into a forest land, yeah.
So they'll cite and say, well, all these other colors have all these tools that, every color should have access to, but white doesn't. And I want to say, no, it's wonderful when we have this diversity of the colors do different things. And the fact that, sure, there are these exceptions, that is the problem. The fact that there's these, really homogenized effects that every color has access to. So if I were King of Commander...
a 3/3 is a big downside in a one-on-one game limited with 20 life.
Totally.
Beast Within, not that great. But when you have a gazillion life and 3/3s don't matter, then it becomes just an instant speed Vindicate. And yeah, that's because of the rules of the structure of the format. It's not because the card is inherently broken. Like turning things into a 3/3.
It's kind of a break even outside of that.
Yeah, I guess it's close. I think.
It's close. Anyway, so all that to say, if I were King of Commander, I would ban not Primeval Titan and Sylvan Primordial. I would instead ban Beast Within, Rapid Hybridization, Hornet Queen, top of my shit list.
Whenever Anthony gets a chance to drag Hornet Queen, you know he's going to do it.
Card. That card is a black-white card. What were they thinking?
I mean, it's my favorite black-green Sarah Angel.
I remember somebody mocked up the black-green Sarah Angel, and it looked gorgeous.
We could have it in the next Planar Chaos set. Do they print that card in Mystery Boosters as a troll? Am I making that up?
Oh, as one of the playtest cards? I don't think so.
It'd be pretty funny if they made one of the playtest cards that card is to troll people.
I think we should end on a positive note.
Yeah,
what have you got?
Cube is great, Magic's great, Commander's great. Just put some cards together and do whatever you think is right, and you really can't go wrong, I don't think. In some ways, that's a very nihilistic take. That's not even a very positive note. It's just nothing matters. It doesn't matter what you do. It's going to be fun no matter what, so just do whatever you want.
No, I think that's a great point, because if you build your commander deck, like, for example, one of the ones sitting behind me is Gargos, and it just casts a Hydra every turn, and that's it.
Hydra. Single Hydra every turn.
And that Hydra gets killed, somebody casts Wrath of God, and all my Hydras are dead, and then my game plan is just to cast one other Hydra for the next turns. And it's a horrible deck, and I don't have fun playing it, and I thought I had taken it apart.
One Hydra at a time.
But you never have that risk of building a deck that just doesn't stack up at the table if you're building a cube. You can collect all your favorite cards, put them into your cube, and then as, a play group, you can try and optimize it, and everyone is sort of on a level playing field. So that's why I really, really love Cube as being the bridge between these two formats, where I get to explore all of the depth, even fewer banned cards than in Commander, and try and make them playable in an environment. But I also get to be a little bit of a spike and try and actually optimize within that in a balanced way.
Really, the biggest hurdle to get into Cube, I think, over Commander is that a lot of players don't want to play with anybody else's cards, which I understand. I'm right in that same boat. Like, I have been in so many situations where I didn't bring a Commander deck to an FNM or whatever, and a pod is firing up and someone offers to lend me a deck, and I'm like, I don't really want to do that. I don't want to play your deck. It's not as fun to me. And so, like, it is a real hurdle, I think, that we should acknowledge. It's especially true if you don't have, like, a very consistent play group where maybe you don't even want to put your cards in the hand of strangers if they don't know you. That's a thing that makes total sense. So that's a big hurdle. It's worth sort of acknowledging. And if that's a limitation you have, then it's a hard thing to overcome. And I wish you the best in dealing with it. But yeah, that I think is the biggest jump between Commander and EDH is just that fact. And once you can get over that hump or find a play group that's willing to point their collective energy at a different person's cube or project every week or every other week and kind of like rotate around the group, then you're in a very good spot, I think, because it's a beautiful world out there to be explored if you're just able to get over that hurdle.
Or, maybe get together as a play group if you have a solid play group and build a cube as a team.
Team Cube.
Team Cube.
Something that really struck me that I saw on the Cube subreddit in the very early days was somebody was posted a picture of their Cube deck, and all the sleeves were all different colors, and it was very weird. And someone in the comments was like, why are all your sleeves different colors? And the person was like, well, I just didn't want to buy a bunch of sleeves. I just had a bunch of sleeves, so I sleeved it up. He's like, there's like 30 different sleeves here. Like, you can't remember what's in what. Like, it's all just a big pile of just random sleeves. And I wonder if you could, build a cube where you got like your 8 players in your play group, everyone throws some cards in, and they're all sleeved up differently. And you're not going to remember what color sleeve the Snapcaster Mage is in, probably, but that allows you to kind of keep the collection separate and just build this big motley pile of a cube.
Why not?
All right, let's wrap it up there. Thank you for listening to Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. We have show notes for the show that I spend a decent amount of time writing every week. I will include links to the Solely Singleton episode with Gavin Verhey in the show notes, so go check that out, as well as everything else we talked about. You can find all of that at luckypaper.co/podcast/22. Everybody out there should go throw us a review on iTunes. We haven't asked for that in a while, and it really does help, because a lot of people, they don't know if our show's any good, and they're not going to listen to it, because it's like an hour long, and so, they're not going to listen and think it's good. Maybe I put some dumb joke at the beginning that makes them just shut it off immediately. They're like, what is this garbage? So leave a nice review for us on Apple Podcasts if you don't mind. 5 stars is the only number of stars we want, and say something nice about the show in your written review. That would be very helpful.
Yeah, like a great review would be like 5 stars, just go to minute 3 to skip Andy's garbage.
Yeah, you could do that, for example. I would gladly accept that as a rating. If you give us 5 stars, you can write whatever you want in that text box. I do not care. I just want the 5 stars.
They can write whatever they want, even if they don't give us 5 stars. I hate to break it to you.
No, actually, they can't. I will find them and ban them from the podcast if they do that.
Oof. You ready to steal the ban wars? I regret not banning you from EPM.
I came very close to banning you too, just because I wanted to have the clip of David reading the ban, and I was going to write in the ban, Andy bans Anthony, so he has more time to work on his Magic the Gathering podcast. And I'm sure
was
they
going
would
to
have
do
mocked,
exactly the same thing.
I'm sure they would have mocked Magic the Gathering a little bit on the show, and then we could have used it as an intro to the show. I came very close to doing it, but then I didn't, so here we are. Anyway, thank you to all of you out there for listening, and thank you, Anthony, for talking about Magic with me.
Yeah, I'm going to go to bed right now. I'm so tired of gardening.